Have you ever played a Super Nintendo game, a NES game, a Mega Drive game, Genesis game, even a 32X game, and you notice that your save games no longer save? You've got really far in the game, and all of a sudden your save game's been reset. Well, that is because the backup battery, which lives inside the cartridge, is probably dead, and today we're going to replace it. So let's get going. So this method will work on SNES games, NES games, Master System games, Mega Drive games, Genesis games, 32X, all that stuff, very similar. And today what we're going to do, we're going to remove the old battery, which is actually soldered onto the board. We're going to put a socket in there so that in future, when our next battery dies, we can just pop it out and put a new one in, no more soldering required. And speaking of soldering, it doesn't matter if you have a fancy thing like this or a tiny little pokey stick like this. The principles are very similar. We're just going to do a little bit of soldering. If you ever see those videos where they get a little knife and, you know, get the battery out, then use masking tape or electrical tape in there, do not do that to yourself. You're worth a lot better than that. That is awful. For a start, your battery eventually is going to start flopping around the place. You're going to lose your save data anyway. Dry environment, it's going to get dry and lodge out. It could get sticky. It is just bad. So let's do this job properly. We're going to use proper tools. And if you sell the game, it's actually going to add value. You know, people are going to appreciate that you've actually done this. So this is definitely the recommended way of replacing the battery. So the first step, we're actually going to open up the case. It's held on by two 6-prong screws right here. You will need a special screwdriver. It looks a little bit like this. It's quite hard to focus on. All the tools I use in the video are linked in the description below, so do check those out. You will need something like this. So it's just a case of putting it on there and undoing each screw on the cartridge. So one here and one here. So with the screws loose and removed, we can see the board here, and this is pretty much your whole entire game on here, and you can see the backup battery lives right here. Now how do I actually know which cartridges contain batteries? Well, so here's a full list of SNES games that have backup batteries, and whether it's a US or a Japanese or a European region, it's the same kind of thing. We replace the battery. Again with NES, there's the battery again, same exact battery too. They also go in motherboards, by the way, so you can, you know, buy a set and use them for other things. Master System even, if you ever knew that. Mega Drive, Genesis, Game Gear, and 32X. So lots of games use batteries. Let's get on with it. So here's our board right here. This little top prong here is actually soldered onto the positive side of the battery, and the negative, similar underneath, and it's actually soldered onto the board here and here. This is how it came out of the factory. It's a bad design, but you know, it is what it is. And these batteries, they can last 20 years. It's absolutely nuts, you know, so credit to these. So what we're going to do now, we're actually going to desolder this. You have two options. First, if you have a tool like this, what this does, it actually heats the end here, but down here there's a little hole, and what happens is you put this over the spike right there, and it has a little inbuilt suction pump, so it heats it, and when you press this, it sucks the solder up inside it. So that's something you can use. Number two, you can use a soldering iron, something like this. You heat up the solder, and similarly it's just a separate tool that will suck the solder up inside here. Then you can eject it. So a couple of things you can use. And a third option, some soldering braid. That'll, you know, when you start melting this solder here, the soldering braid can, you know, sort of interlace with it, and you can just pull it up like that. So 3 methods we can use to desolder these 2 pins right here. What I recommend using, especially working with older boards, you know, that are a couple of decades old, is some flux. It's also called soldering paste. It sort of amplifies the soldering process. It's made of something like tree sap or something like that. And what you do, you could just put a little bit on the solder there, and when you apply a soldering iron to this, it's going to fizz and crackle and it'll instantly come off. You know, it gets a lot hotter. So this stuff is really good. And similarly, when you solder it back together, this actually improves your joints, so you don't get little micro cracks in there and get dry joints. So this is a you know, this is really good to have if you have some lying around. It doesn't cost much, and again, I'll link it in the description below. So listen to the flux. See how quick that melted? That solder probably hasn't been touched in a long time. Usually solder like that, especially if you have a cheap soldering iron, it can take a long time to come off there. Okay, so once most of the solder's off here, get a little plastic tool, whether it's a little scraper, guitar pick, and place it between the battery and the circuit board, just like that. And then just pry down slightly, not too much pressure. And then when you start melting the remaining bit of the solder, you know, there's not going to be much left because we de-soldered a lot of it. It'll slowly start prying away from the board here. So you can see the battery's up on one side. And now we don't need the tool at all, we can just grab it with our hands here and do the same again. And there we go, the battery's been completely removed from the board. So once we've desoldered the battery here, we're going to end up with something a little like this. So we have our holes ready for the new sort of battery container here, and this is the old one. We can discard this, we no longer need this anymore. So let's talk about these battery sockets now. These will hold our new battery so we can replace the battery a lot easier later on. Now the ones we have are kind of slimline ones, they're not the full round ones, and that's because it won't fit in the case, otherwise there's not enough clearance for this battery holder, you know, the full circular ones to fit in here with the board. It won't actually close the case. So that's why we use these ones here. And if you look underneath, the terminals here are facing left and right. Now we need to get you know, a small little knife or something and just rotate this 90 degrees so both terminals are pointing upwards. Now if you get very cheap battery holders, then these, as soon as you turn them around 80 degrees, they will snap on you. If that happens to you, return them because they're a pile of crap, and get some that don't do that. So if you find these keep snapping on you and you rotate them, don't use those, it's not worth it, because when you solder them into the board and they snap off, you know, kind of randomly, you don't want to be chasing a problem down the line. So make sure they're of good quality. So you can see here, we've just rotated the terminals 90 degrees using some pliers, so we can easily install it into the board. So to get it back into the board, I first recommend cleaning any residual flux that we used, so that's this stuff here, with isopropyl alcohol. Over time, if you leave flux on boards, I don't recommend it, it can actually degrade the board. Use some high concentrate, I think 91's fine. The difference really, it just evaporates quicker, so you don't want anything to short. That's pretty much the difference there. So we're just going to clean any residual flux off there, if you did use that, using isopropyl alcohol. Get it nice and clean. When it's all nice and dry, which will be, you know, very quickly, we're going to press our terminal onto the board. Now the terminal should only go one way. This one's slightly fatter, that one's thinner, and they'll go in the respective holes there. So when pressing the socket back in, you'll have to get rid of every little bit of solder on there using like a de-soldering tool. Alternatively, if you have a pair of helping hands, it's like these kind of little crocodile clip arms, you can suspend the board in the air so you don't have to hold it. Underneath, you can heat it with a soldering iron to get the solder nice and kind of, you know, liquefied, and then with the other hand you can press this on at the same time, and that way you won't need to remove every little bit of solder out these holes. So a couple of ways you can actually install this. So I've put the battery socket in there, push it all the way through so the terminals are all the way clear, so it's nicely pressed against the board. I'm just going to put a tiny bit of flux on there, or you can use flux core solder, that's fine, and we're just going to solder it up. So now we're soldered up, you can see that flux is kind of spat everywhere, all over the little traces, so we're going to clean that up with some isopropyl alcohol. when soldering, always make sure the soldering iron is hot enough, otherwise you don't get a nice consistent joint on there. So what you do, once it's all on and you're sort of happy with it, give it that final kind of reflow where everything melts together and it has a nice sort of smooth finish to it. That way you're not going to get any dry joints or little small kind of cracks in your solder, and it just has a really nice sort of flow to it here. So it's not a soldering tutorial, it's pretty much just making sure this battery holder's on. So now we've turned the board over, what you'll have is something like this, a lot easier now. So if in future your battery ever dies, pop it out, pop another one in, you are done. So the batteries, I recommend a nice branded battery. The last thing you want is a cheap one to kind of leak over the board. That would be really bad. I don't have any right now, I've ordered some, but I'm just going to show you with this one so we can see it through. These are CR2032 batteries, so if you have a computer, motherboard, you've changed the CMOS battery, that's pretty much it. It's exactly the same one. So you may already have some of these in your house for whatever reason. What we're going to do, because if you really want to settle with a cheap one, test it first. The last thing you want to do is put a bad battery in here and you can't kind of troubleshoot the problem to a poor solder joint, a bad battery. So we're just going to test it real quick before we put it in. So the battery looks good. When handling these batteries, avoid touching the top and the bottom at the same time. It's just something I was always taught. So now we're going to put it in. So the battery is in. While the board is out, let's clean the terminals. It's the best time to do this. Again, we can use isopropyl alcohol, a nice high concentration to do this. Get some on a cotton bud or something like that and just run these kind of contacts all the way down, back and forth. Same on the other side. It's the best thing you can do now this is out. And once you've done that, we're going to put it back into the cartridge and test it and see if we can create a save game, reset it and see if it works again. So once you've done one, you get your technique down, you can pop them off pretty quickly and soon sort of, tackle your whole collection. Okay, moment of truth. Let's see if we broke it. Oh, that's a good sign. Let's see if we can create a save game. So empty. So I totally forgot you have to do a castle or a ghost house and maybe a switch to save the game. I don't think it matters because you can kind of just go back to the start and see a save file with 0, but let's do it properly. It was fun. It's been so long. So here we go. I want to continue and save. So now we're going to reset it. Moment of truth. Does it save the game? It looks like it does. Let's do a hard reset so it's not a fluke. And if that works, then yeah, there's our battery, nicely installed. If you ever need a new one, you can easily take it out and replace it. That is how to do it properly and without masking tape and any other sort of ghetto methods. This is the way. Couple of things I'll mention. If you're not really sure about this process and your ability, your confidence, start with a very common game. When you build up enough confidence, whip out the Chrono Trigger, the quite expensive game, and give it a go on that, but start small. One other thing I forgot to mention is that if you actually do this really quickly, then your save game may still persist in the RAM. So if you've got super far on Super Mario World, for example, you're really comfortable in your ability, you've practiced on some sort of more common games, then go to the game with your save game in there, do it really quickly, and chances are you've got that battery in there quick enough to persist your save game in the RAM. It is possible. I haven't tried it firsthand, but you should let me know in the comments below. So I hope this video helped you. Good luck, and yeah, keep trucking with your SNES. Take care.